The dusty floor of the general store seemed to pulse with the midday heat as Zelda Crawford watched her last chance at survival slip through her fingers like sand through a sieve. $3 for the whole load. Zelda's voice cracked despite her attempt to sound steady. Mr. Hargrove, these pelts took me 2 months to trap. They're worth at least 20. The trader leaned back against his counter, his tobacco-stained teeth showing through a cruel smile. Maybe to someone else, girlie, but you're standing in my store and I say they're worth 3. Take it or leave it. Zelda's hands trembled as she clutched the bundle of beaver and fox pelts closer to her chest. Her father had been dead for 6 weeks now, claimed by the fever that swept through Eureka, Nevada that terrible spring of 1878. The small cabin, 5 miles outside town, still had his traps hanging on the wall, and she taught herself to use them out of sheer desperation. Her mother had passed 3 years prior, and now at 21 years old, Zelda faced the world alone with nothing but calloused hands and determination that was quickly eroding under Hargrove's contemptuous stare. "Please," she whispered, hating the word even as it left her lips. "I need enough to pay the land tax. If I don't pay by Friday, they'll take the cabin." "Not my problem," Hargrove said, examining his fingernails with deliberate disinterest. $3, and I'm being generous." The bell above the door chimed, and Zelda didn't bother turning around. She was too focused on trying not to cry, on maintaining some shred of dignity even as her world crumbled. Behind her, she heard the distinctive sound of spurs against wooden floorboards, that particular rhythm that marked a man who'd spent more time in a saddle than standing still. "I think you'll want to reconsider that." A deep voice drawled from somewhere behind her left shoulder. Hargrove's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to something resembling nervousness. Zelda finally turned to see who had spoken and found herself looking at a man who seemed to have been carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded Eureka. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block the sunlight streaming through the doorway. His hat was dusty from the trail, and his sun-weathered face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting at distant horizons. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale gray like storm clouds, and currently fixed on Hargrove with an intensity that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "Quinn Zimmerman," Hargrove said, and Zelda heard the fear poorly masked in his voice. "Didn't know you were back in town." "Clearly," Quinn said, his voice still carrying that lazy drawl that somehow made his words more threatening rather than less. He moved past Zelda with a courtesy that seemed at odds with the tension radiating from him, tipping his hat to her briefly before placing both hands flat on Hargrove's counter. "Now, I've been away for a spell, working a cattle drive up to Montana and back. But I'm fairly certain the going rate for pelts like these hasn't dropped from $20 to $3 in the 6 months I've been gone. Unless something has changed in the fundamental laws of economics that I'm not aware of." "I run my business how I see fit," Hargrove said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "That you do," Quinn agreed amiably. "And I respect a man's right to trade as he pleases, but I also seem to recall that your store here runs on credit from the Miners' Bank. The same bank where my uncle Edmund Zimmerman happens to be the primary stakeholder. Now, I don't like to throw family connections around, but I can't help but think Uncle Edmund would be mighty interested to hear about how one of his creditors is taking advantage of a woman alone, trying to pay an honest debt with honest work." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a fly buzzing against the window glass. Zelda stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe, watching as Hargrove's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a sickly pale. "I may have been hasty in my evaluation," Hargrove finally said through gritted teeth. He reached under the counter and pulled out a cash box with movements so reluctant they might have been comical under different circumstances. $20, you said. That's the fair price, Quinn said, straightening up. Though I'd say 25 would be closer to accurate, given the quality. Those are prime pelts, and you know it. Hargrove counted out $25 with the expression of a man being forced to swallow broken glass. Zelda stepped forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body, reaching out with a shaking hand to accept the money. It was more than she'd seen in months, enough to pay the land tax with money left over for supplies. "Thank you," she managed to say to Hargrove, though the words felt strange. Then she turned to Quinn, who had stepped back to give her space. "And thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. I don't know how to repay this kindness." "No repayment necessary, miss," Quinn said, and when he looked at her, his expression softened from the hard edge it had carried when dealing with Hargrove. "Just couldn't stand by and watch someone get cheated. Wouldn't sit right." Outside, the main street of Eureka stretched in both directions, a collection of weathered buildings that served the silver miners and cattlemen who made up most of the population. The June sun beat down mercilessly, and Zelda paused in the shade of the store's awning, carefully tucking the precious money into the inside pocket of her worn jacket. Quinn emerged a moment later, carrying a sack of supplies that he tied to his saddle. His horse was a rangy buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes, and it nickered softly as Quinn checked the knot. Only then did he turn back to Zelda, removing his hat in a gesture that seemed both natural and oddly formal. "If you don't mind my saying so, miss, you look like you could use a decent meal. The hotel dining room serves a fair plate of roast beef, and I was heading there myself. Would you permit me to buy you dinner?" Zelda's first instinct was to refuse. She'd been raised to be wary of strangers, especially men who seemed too helpful. But something about Quinn's manner, the way he'd stepped in without being asked and then stepped back without demanding gratitude or recognition, made her hesitate. Besides, she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything more substantial than the thin stew she made from wild onions and the occasional rabbit. "I wouldn't want to impose," she said carefully. "No imposition at all," Quinn replied. "Truth is, I've been eating trail dust and hardtack for 6 months. I could use some civilized conversation along with that roast beef, and you'd be doing me a favor." She found herself smiling despite everything. "In that case, Mr. Zimmerman, I accept." "Quinn," he said. "Just Quinn." "Mr. Zimmerman is my father, and he's a considerably more respectable gentleman than I'll ever be." "Zelda," she offered in return. "Zelda Crawford." The hotel dining room was only half full at this hour, most of the miners still at work in the silver claims that dotted the surrounding hills. Quinn led her to a table by the window, pulling out her chair with an old-fashioned courtesy that made her heart ache a little. Her father had been a gentleman like that, before the fever took him. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Martha who Zelda recognized from church, brought them water and menus. Her eyebrows rose slightly at seeing Zelda in such company, but she said nothing beyond taking their orders. Quinn ordered the roast beef he'd mentioned, and Zelda did the same, her stomach growling at the mere thought of it. "So," Quinn said once Martha had departed, "you've been trapping. That's not easy work, especially alone." "My father taught me when I was younger," Zelda said, surprised to find that talking about it didn't hurt quite as much as she'd expected. "We used to check the trap lines together. After he passed, I thought I could manage well enough on my own, but apparently I didn't account for men like Hargrove." Quinn's jaw tightened slightly. "Hargrove's always been a vulture. Preys on anyone he thinks can't fight back." "I'm sorry you had to deal with that, and sorrier still about your father." "Fever," she nodded. This past April, it swept through town fast, took 12 people before it burned itself out. I heard about it up in Montana, Quinn said quietly. Lost some good people by all accounts. I'm sorry I wasn't here to pay my respects proper. The food arrived, saving Zelda from having to respond. The roast beef was as good as Quinn had promised, tender and rich, accompanied by roasted potatoes and carrots that tasted like heaven after months of subsistence eating. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Zelda found herself studying her companion between bites. Quinn Zimmerman looked to be somewhere in his late 20s, weathered by sun and hard work, but with an underlying strength that went beyond the physical. There was something careful in the way he moved, like a man who'd learned to be aware of his surroundings at all times. His hands, resting on either side of his plate when he wasn't eating, were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who'd spent years working cattle and horses. But his manners were refined, his speech educated despite the frontier drawl. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Ask away." "Why did you really help me back there? You don't know me. For all you knew, maybe Hargrove was right and the pelts weren't worth what I claimed." Quinn set down his fork and met her eyes directly. "I knew the pelts were worth it because I've traded enough furs to recognize quality. But even if I hadn't known, I would have stepped in. There's helping folks because you want something in return, and then there's helping folks because it's the right thing to do. I was raised to believe in the latter. Your family must be good people." "My mother was," Quinn said, and something sad flickered across his face. "She passed when I was 15. My father and uncle are decent men in their way, but it was Ma who taught me that being strong doesn't mean using that strength to push others around. Means using it to protect those who need protecting." The afternoon stretched into evening as they talked. Zelda found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone since her father's death, telling Quinn about the cabin, about her struggles to maintain it alone, about the isolation that sometimes felt like it would swallow her whole. In turn, Quinn spoke of his work as a cowboy, about the cattle drives that took him from Texas to Montana and back again, about the endless miles of open country and the strange beauty of a life spent under open sky. "Don't you get lonely?" Zelda asked at one point. "Sometimes," Quinn admitted. "But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I've known men surrounded by others who were the loneliest souls you'd ever meet. And I've known men who could ride for days without seeing another person and be perfectly content. It's not about the people around you so much as having a purpose, something that makes the work worth doing. And you have that, a purpose." Quinn was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the tablecloth. "I thought I did. Lately, though, I've been wondering if maybe there's something more I should be looking for. Something I haven't found yet." The sun was setting by the time they finally left the hotel, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the desert landscape look almost gentle. Quinn walked Zelda to where her wagon was hitched outside the general store, a battered old thing that had belonged to her father. "Where's your cabin?" Quinn asked. 5 miles outside town, you said." "West along Dry Creek. It's about an hour's drive from here." Quinn frowned. "That's a lonely stretch, especially after dark. Would you allow me to ride escort, just to make sure you get home safe?" "You've already done so much," Zelda protested, but her heart wasn't in it. The truth was, the thought of making that drive alone in the dark with the day's cash in her pocket frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "Then a bit more won't make much difference," Quinn said easily. "Besides, my father's ranch is north of town. I'll be heading out that direction anyway once I see you home." The ride out to the cabin was peaceful, the cooling desert air a relief after the day's heat. Quinn rode alongside the wagon, his buckskin moving with the easy gait of a well-trained horse. They talked less on this journey, but the silence felt companionable rather than awkward. Zelda found herself acutely aware of Quinn's presence, of the way he sat his horse with unconscious grace, of the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for any danger. When they finally reached the cabin, a small structure of weathered wood with a stone chimney, Quinn dismounted and helped Zelda down from the wagon with a hand that was steady and warm. In the twilight, standing close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes, Zelda felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went beyond simple gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything today. You didn't have to help me, but you did, and I won't forget it." Quinn's hand lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. "I'm glad I could help, Zelda. If you ever need anything, you can find me at the Zimmerman Ranch, about 10 miles north. Just ask anyone in town for directions." "I will," she promised, and meant it. She watched him ride away into the gathering darkness, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared entirely into the night. Only then did she go inside, where the cabin felt both emptier and somehow more full than it had in weeks. She lit a lamp and counted the money again, making sure it was real, that the day hadn't been some desperate dream. $25. Enough to pay the land tax, enough to buy supplies, enough to give her breathing room for the first time since her father's death. But as she prepared for bed, it wasn't the money she thought about. It was gray eyes and calloused hands, a lazy drawl that could turn hard as steel when defending a stranger, the unexpected kindness of a man who'd stepped in without being asked. The next morning, Zelda woke with the sun and immediately set about the tasks that had been piling up during her focus on trapping. She paid the land tax in town, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders as the clerk stamped the receipt. She bought supplies, real supplies, including flour and sugar and coffee. And then, on an impulse she didn't fully understand, she stopped by the general store and bought fabric for a new dress. "Haven't seen you look this lively in months," Martha commented when Zelda ran into her outside the post office. "Something good happened. Just finally got caught up on some bills," Zelda said, but she could feel the blush creeping up her neck. Martha's knowing smile suggested she saw right through the deflection. "Heard you had dinner with young Quinn Zimmerman yesterday. He's a good man, that one. His mother, bless her soul, raised him right. We just happened to cross paths," Zelda said, trying to sound casual. "Hum," Martha said, in a tone that suggested she believed that about as much as she believed the moon was made of cheese. "Well, if you just happen to cross paths again, you could do worse. Quinn Zimmerman is one of the few men around here worth a woman's time." Over the following weeks, Zelda threw herself into making the cabin and the land around it productive. She planted a garden, working the rocky soil until her hands bled. She repaired the chicken coop and bought 3 hens from a farmer east of town. She fixed the leaking roof and cleared brush away from the creek that gave the area its name. The work was exhausting, but it felt good to be building something rather than just struggling to survive. She also found herself watching the road more than she wanted to admit, looking for a particular rider on a buckskin horse. But the days turned into a week, and then 2, with no sign of Quinn. She told herself it was foolish to expect anything different. He'd done her a kindness, but that didn't mean he owed her his time or attention. He had his own life, his own work on his family's ranch. Still, she couldn't help the disappointment that settled in her chest like a stone. It was a Thursday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after their first meeting, when Zelda heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin. She was in the garden, wrestling with a particularly stubborn weed, and looked up with dirt on her face, and her hair escaping from its braid in wild tangles. The sight of Quinn riding up the path made her heart leap in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Afternoon," Quinn called, swinging down from the saddle with fluid ease. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Zelda said, wiping her hands on her apron and very aware of how disheveled she must look. "I wasn't expecting company." "I apologize for not coming by sooner," Quinn said, removing his hat. "We had some trouble with rustlers up at the ranch, and it took all hands to deal with it. But I've been thinking about you, wondering how you were getting on." The simple honesty of the statement made Zelda's breath catch. "I'm doing well. Better than I have in a long time, thanks to you. Would you like some water? Or I could make coffee if you have time." "Coffee sounds good," Quinn said. "And if you have any work that needs a second pair of hands, I'd be glad to help." They ended up spending the afternoon working side by side, Quinn helping her reinforce the chicken coop while Zelda finished her garden work. They talked easily, the conversation flowing naturally from one topic to another. Quinn told her about the rustlers, a gang that had been operating throughout the territory, and how they'd finally driven them off. Zelda told him about her progress with the cabin, about the small victories and the larger struggles. When the sun started to sink low, Quinn helped her carry water from the creek for the garden, his presence making the work lighter somehow. They ended up sitting on the porch steps, drinking coffee and watching the desert turn gold in the fading light. "Can I ask you something personal?" Quinn said after a stretch of comfortable silence. "You can ask," Zelda replied, "though I can't promise I'll answer." That earned her a slight smile. "Fair enough. What made you decide to stay here alone? You're young, capable. You could have sold the cabin, moved to a larger town where there'd be more opportunities, more people." Zelda considered the question carefully. "This was my parents' dream. My father worked for 15 years to save enough money to buy this land, to build this cabin. My mother planted that apple tree over there the year before she died. This place is all I have left of them, and I couldn't bear to let it go. Maybe that's foolish, clinging to the past when the present is so hard, but it's the truth." "That's not foolish," Quinn said quietly. "That's loyalty, and loyalty is a rare thing. Your parents would be proud of you, fighting so hard to keep their dream alive." The words, spoken with such simple conviction, brought tears to Zelda's eyes. She blinked them back furiously, embarrassed, but Quinn's hand found hers, warm and steady. "It's all right to miss them," he said. "It's all right to be sad sometimes." "If I let myself be sad, I'm afraid I'll never stop," Zelda whispered. "There's too much work to do, and I can't afford to fall apart." "Maybe that's why you need someone to share the load," Quinn said. "No one's meant to carry everything alone." They sat there as the stars began to emerge, hands linked, neither speaking but both feeling the weight of words unspoken. When Quinn finally rose to leave, promising to come back soon, Zelda stood at the edge of the porch and watched him go with a feeling in her chest that was equal parts hope and fear. True to his word, Quinn began visiting regularly. Sometimes he'd arrive in the afternoon and stay for just an hour, helping with whatever task needed doing. Other times he'd come in the morning and stay until evening, working alongside Zelda as they gradually transformed the cabin and its surrounding land into something that felt less like survival and more like a real homestead. They fell into an easy partnership. Quinn taught Zelda things his years as a cowboy had taught him: how to better read the weather, how to gentle a horse with patience rather than force, how to track game through terrain that looked empty to untrained eyes. In turn, Zelda showed Quinn the quieter pleasures of a settled life, teaching him to appreciate the satisfaction of a garden coming to life, the simple joy of watching chickens scratch in the yard, the peace that came from building something meant to last. But beyond the work, they talked. Long conversations that ranged from the philosophical to the practical, from dreams to fears to the small observations that made up daily life. Zelda learned that Quinn had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman in Texas who'd ultimately decided she couldn't live the uncertain life of a cowboy's wife. The breakup had been amicable but painful, and Quinn had thrown himself into his work afterward, spending more time on the trail than at home. "Do you regret it?" Zelda asked one evening as they sat on the porch, shelling peas for dinner. "Letting her go." "I didn't let her go," Quinn said thoughtfully. "She made a choice and I respected it. As for regret, not really. If she'd stayed, she would have been miserable, and that would have made us both miserable. Better to part as friends than destroy each other trying to force something that wasn't meant to be. But you still want that. A wife, a family." Quinn's eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. "I do. But I've learned that wanting something and forcing it are two different things. The right woman, the right life, that'll come when it's meant to. Can't rush these things." The summer deepened, and with it, the connection between Zelda and Quinn grew stronger. He began staying for dinner more often, and then sometimes he'd linger afterward, neither of them quite ready for him to leave. They'd sit on the porch and watch the stars, talking about everything and nothing, their shoulders touching, hands occasionally brushing in ways that felt both accidental and inevitable. It was a Sunday in late July when everything changed. Quinn had come by in the morning to help Zelda repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a windstorm. They'd been working for several hours, the sun beating down mercilessly, when Zelda climbed down from the fence rail and stumbled slightly, dizzy from the heat. Quinn caught her before she could fall, his arms strong and sure around her waist. For a moment they stood frozen, her hands braced against his chest, his face inches from hers. She could feel his heart beating, fast and strong, matching the rhythm of her own. "Zelda," he said, her name barely a whisper. She didn't let herself think, didn't let herself doubt. She rose on her toes and kissed him, a brief press of lips that lasted only a second before she pulled back, terrified she'd made a mistake. But Quinn's arms tightened around her, and then he was kissing her back, deep and slow and thorough, one hand coming up to cup her face with a tenderness that made her want to cry. The world seemed to fall away, narrowing to just this moment, this man, this feeling of rightness that went beyond logic or reason. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "But I didn't want to presume, didn't want to push you into something you weren't ready for." "I'm ready," Zelda said, her voice shaking slightly. "Quinn, I'm so ready." They spent the rest of the day finishing the fence, but everything felt different now, charged with a new awareness. Every casual touch became significant, every glance meaningful. When Quinn left that evening, he kissed her again at the door, a long, sweet kiss that promised more to come. "I want to court you properly," he said, his hands framing her face. "I want to do this right, Zelda. You deserve that." "I'd like that," she said, smiling up at him. "I'd like that very much." The courtship that followed was unlike anything Zelda had imagined. Quinn was attentive without being overwhelming, romantic without being foolish about it. He brought her wildflowers from the hills, books he thought she'd enjoy, small gifts that showed he paid attention to the things she mentioned in passing. They went on picnics by the creek, took long rides through the countryside, spent Sunday afternoons in town attending church, and then having dinner at the hotel. The townspeople noticed, of course. Eureka was small enough that everyone noticed everything, but the gossip was largely approving. Martha made a point of telling Zelda that she was glad to see her happy, and even Hargrove at the general store was notably more polite when Quinn was around. Quinn's family proved more complicated. His father, Edmund Zimmerman, was a stern man who'd built his ranch through decades of hard work and shrewd business dealings. He approved of Zelda in theory, Quinn told her, but had concerns about his son settling down with a woman who had no money or connections. "What did you tell him?" Zelda asked, trying not to let the hurt show in her voice. "I told him that if he couldn't see your worth, then he was a lot less wise than I'd always believed," Quinn said firmly. "You're strong, capable, and you've managed to hold onto your land and your dignity in circumstances that would have broken most people. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth worrying about." The summer gave way to fall, and with the cooling weather came a deepening of their relationship. They were careful about propriety, never spending the night under the same roof, always maintaining the appearance of respectability that frontier society demanded. But within those boundaries, they grew closer in every way that mattered. It was a crisp October evening when Quinn arrived at the cabin with a nervous energy that Zelda had never seen in him before. They'd planned a simple dinner, but he barely touched his food, his eyes following her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You're making me nervous," Zelda finally said, setting down her fork. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Quinn said quickly. Then he took a deep breath and stood, coming around the table to kneel beside her chair. "Everything's right, actually. More right than I ever thought possible." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. When he opened it, Zelda saw a simple gold band set with a small diamond that caught the lamplight. "Zelda Crawford, I know we've only been courting for a few months. I know there are practical considerations we probably should discuss. But I also know that I love you more than I thought I could love anyone. I know that every day I spend with you makes me want to be a better man. I know that when I think about my future, you're in every part of it. So I'm asking, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me?" Tears were streaming down Zelda's face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, the word coming out choked but clear. "Yes, Quinn, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her tight while she cried happy tears into his shoulder. When she finally pulled back enough to look at him, she saw that his eyes were wet too. "I love you," she said, the words feeling both momentous and natural. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," Quinn murmured, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "We'll figure everything out together. That's what marriage is, right? Figuring out life together." They set the wedding for early November, giving themselves just enough time to make arrangements. It would be a simple ceremony at the church in town, followed by a reception at the hotel. Quinn's family would attend, though Zelda sensed his father's disapproval still lingered. But she had Martha and a few other friends she'd made in town, and that would have to be enough. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of preparation. Zelda finished the dress she'd been sewing from the fabric she'd bought months ago, adding lace at the collar and cuffs that Martha helped her attach. Quinn spent his time adding a room onto the cabin, insisting that they'd need more space for their future family. His father had grudgingly agreed to give them some cattle as a wedding present, enough to start a small herd that could eventually grow into something substantial. On the morning of November 10th, 1878, Zelda stood in a small room at the back of the church, looking at herself in the mirror Martha had brought. The dress fit perfectly, the white fabric simple but elegant, her dark hair pinned up with wildflowers that Quinn had picked the day before. "You look beautiful," Martha said, her eyes misty. "Your mother would be so proud." Zelda felt the familiar ache of loss, but it was gentler now, tempered by the joy of the moment. "I wish they could be here," she said softly. "Both of them." "They are," Martha said firmly. In all the ways that matter, they're here. The ceremony itself passed in a haze of emotion. Zelda was aware of Quinn standing beside her, looking handsome in a new suit, his hand steady as he slipped the wedding band onto her finger. She heard herself say the vows, felt the weight of their meaning, saw the love shining in Quinn's eyes as he said his own promises. And then the Reverend was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Quinn was kissing her in front of God and the assembled witnesses, and Zelda felt like her heart might burst from happiness. The reception at the hotel was lively despite the small crowd. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing and laughter and more food than seemed possible. Even Quinn Zimmerman unbent enough to toast the happy couple, though his words were more about duty and responsibility than love. But Zelda didn't care. She was too busy dancing with her husband, learning the feel of that word on her tongue. Husband. Quinn was her husband now, and she was his wife, and they had a whole future stretching out before them. When they finally made it back to the cabin that night, Quinn carried Zelda over the threshold in a tradition that made them both laugh. The cabin felt different now, transformed by the addition of the new room and by the simple fact of Quinn's presence. This wasn't just Zelda's lonely outpost anymore. It was their home, the beginning of their shared life. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Zelda listened to Quinn's heartbeat and felt a peace she hadn't known since before her father's death. She'd been so alone for so long, carrying every burden by herself, that having someone to share it with felt almost unreal. "What are you thinking?" Quinn murmured, his hand stroking her hair. "That I'm happy," Zelda said simply. "That for the first time in a long time I'm not afraid of tomorrow." "Good," Quinn said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Because we've got a lot of tomorrows ahead of us, and I intend to make every one of them count." The first year of their marriage brought challenges, as any new beginning does. They had to learn each other's rhythms, how to share space and decisions, and the endless work that came with running a homestead. Quinn continued to take occasional work on cattle drives, though he never stayed away for more than a few weeks at a time. The money he brought back, combined with what they could make from selling eggs and vegetables and the occasional calf, was enough to keep them comfortable. But more than the practical matters, they learned how to be partners in the truest sense. Quinn taught Zelda to ride better, until she could handle a horse with the same easy confidence he showed. Zelda taught Quinn the satisfaction of watching seeds turn into plants, of creating beauty and sustenance from rocky soil and determination. They learned each other's fears and hopes, the small habits that made each of them unique, the ways they could support and challenge and love each other through both good times and hard. In the spring of their second year together, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with terror, all the fears she'd pushed aside about childbirth and motherhood rushing back. But Quinn was there, steady as always, holding her when she cried and making plans for the future with an enthusiasm that was infectious. "We'll need a bigger house eventually," he said one evening, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Multiple rooms for all the children we're going to have." "Children, plural," Zelda said, laughing. "Let's see how we manage with one first." Their son was born in December, a difficult labor that left Zelda exhausted but triumphant. They named him Thomas, after Zelda's father, and he had Quinn's gray eyes and Zelda's dark hair. Quinn took to fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything else, pacing the floor with a fussy baby at 2 in the morning, changing diapers without complaint, his big, rough hands surprisingly gentle with their tiny son. Watching Quinn with Thomas, Zelda often found herself overcome with emotion. This was her family, the thing she'd thought she'd lost forever when her parents died. Not a replacement for what she'd had, but something new and equally precious, built from love and determination, and the choice to keep building even when things were hard. Over the next few years, they expanded both their family and their homestead. A daughter, Rebecca, arrived 2 years after Thomas, followed by another son, James, 2 years after that. The cabin grew with them, Quinn adding rooms and a proper second story until it was less a cabin and more a real house. The herd grew too, and they hired a couple of hands to help manage it. What had started as Zelda's desperate attempt to survive had become a thriving ranch, a legacy they were building for their children. Quinn Zimmerman came around eventually, won over by his grandchildren and by the undeniable success of Quinn and Zelda's partnership. He began stopping by regularly, developing a particular fondness for Thomas, who showed early signs of having his grandfather's head for business. The relationship would never be warm, but it was respectful, and that was enough. On their 10th anniversary, Quinn and Zelda rode out to the spot where they'd first kissed, that section of fence that had been damaged in a windstorm a lifetime ago. They'd left the children with Martha for the day, stealing a rare afternoon alone together. "You ever regret it?" Zelda asked, leaning against Quinn as they sat on a blanket overlooking the land they'd built together. "Giving up the trail drives, settling down." "Not for a second," Quinn said firmly. "Everything I was looking for, that purpose I couldn't quite name, I found it here with you. This life, our family, that's worth more than all the adventure in the world. Even on the days when the kids are screaming and the cattle are sick and nothing goes right," Quinn laughed. "Especially then. Because at the end of those days, I get to fall into bed next to you, and that makes everything worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun move across the sky, their hands linked as they'd been that first evening on the porch. So much had changed since that day in the general store when Quinn had stepped in to defend a desperate stranger. But some things remained constant, the fundamental connection that had drawn them together, the love that had only deepened with time and challenge. "Thank you," Zelda said finally. "For what?" "For seeing me that day, for stepping in when you didn't have to, for taking a chance on me." Quinn turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Zelda, you've got it backwards. You're the one who took the chance. I was just a cowboy drifting from one cattle drive to the next, no real roots, no real purpose beyond the next horizon. You gave me a reason to stay, a reason to build something lasting. If anything, I should be thanking you." "Then let's call it even," Zelda said, smiling. "We saved each other." "Fair enough," Quinn agreed, pulling her in for a kiss that still made her heart race after 10 years. "Now and always, we're in this together." They stayed at the overlook until the sun began to set, painting the desert in familiar shades of orange and purple. Then they rode back to the house, to their children and their life and the future they were still building, one day at a time. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow as years always do. Thomas grew into a serious young man who eventually took over much of the ranch management, displaying both his grandfather's business sense and his father's integrity. Rebecca proved to have a gift with horses, gentling even the wildest mustangs with patience and intuition. James, the youngest, inherited his mother's love of the land itself, studying new farming techniques and experimenting with different crops suited to the harsh Nevada climate. Quinn's father passed when Thomas was 18, leaving the Zimmerman ranch to be divided between Quinn and his younger brother. It was a difficult time, but it also brought a kind of closure, a recognition of Quinn's place in the family legacy. They sold the Zimmerman ranch eventually, unable to manage both properties effectively, and used the money to buy more land adjacent to their own, expanding their holdings significantly. Zelda's garden became famous in the region, a riot of flowers and vegetables that seemed impossible in the desert climate. She wrote a series of articles for a farming journal about her techniques, which brought visitors from across the territory seeking her advice. The shy, desperate young woman who'd faced down Hargrove in the general store had become a respected figure in her own right, known for both her knowledge and her generosity. As their children grew and eventually started families of their own, Quinn and Zelda found themselves with time they hadn't had in years. They took to sitting on the porch most evenings, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing, just as they had in the early days of their courtship. 19 grandchildren, Zelda said one evening, shaking her head in wonder. Can you believe it? Barely, Quinn admitted. Seems like just yesterday we were bringing Thomas home from the hospital, terrified we'd break him. You were terrified. I was too exhausted to be scared. Quinn laughed, the sound still as warm and genuine as it had been 30 years ago. His hair had gone mostly gray, and his face bore even more lines than it had when they'd first met, but to Zelda he was as handsome as ever. The years had been kind to him, giving him the dignity of age without diminishing his strength. You think he would have approved? Zelda asked suddenly. My father, of all this of you. Quinn considered the question seriously, as he always did when she brought up her parents. I think he would have been proud of you, regardless. You held on to his dream and turned it into something even bigger. As for me, I'd like to think he'd approve. I've loved his daughter with everything I have, tried to give her the life she deserves. If that's not enough, nothing would be. It's more than enough, Zelda said softly. You've given me everything, Quinn. A home, a family, a partnership that's been the foundation of my entire adult life. I can't imagine what would have become of me if you hadn't walked into that general store that day. You would have figured something out, Quinn said with certainty. You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for, but I'm glad I was there. Glad I got to be part of your story. Our story, Zelda corrected. It's been ours from the beginning. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars they'd watched together countless times over the decades. The world had changed around them, new technologies and new ways of life gradually transforming the frontier into something more settled and civilized. But here, on their porch, looking out over land they'd built together, some things remained constant. The love that had begun with a simple act of kindness, that had grown through shared work and shared dreams, that had weathered challenges and celebrated triumphs, that love remained as strong as ever. It had become the bedrock of not just their lives, but the lives of everyone they'd brought into the world, a legacy more valuable than land or money or any material thing. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, Quinn stood and offered Zelda his hand, pulling her to her feet with the same gentle strength he'd shown that first day. They went inside together, to the home they'd built, surrounded by photographs of their children and grandchildren, by memories of a life well lived, by the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd done right by each other, and by the love that had sustained them through it all. In the years that followed, as they grew older together, they often told their story to their grandchildren. The tale of the desperate young woman and the cowboy who'd stepped in to help her, of a simple act of kindness that had blossomed into something neither of them could have imagined. The children loved it, begging for details, wanting to know every moment of how their grandparents had fallen in love. And Quinn and Zelda would oblige, taking turns with the telling, filling in details the other forgot, their hands linked as they'd been that first evening on the porch, as they would be for all the evenings still to come. Because that was the truth of their love story, not the dramatic beginning or even the challenges they'd overcome, but the simple, profound choice they made every day to keep choosing each other, to keep building together, to remain partners in every sense of the word. When Quinn passed at the age of 79, peacefully in his sleep, Zelda mourned him as deeply as she'd mourned her parents all those decades ago. But even in her grief, she felt grateful. Grateful for the years they'd had, for the family they'd built, for every sunrise and sunset they'd witnessed together. The pain of losing him was proof of how deeply they'd loved, and she wouldn't trade that love for anything. She lived another 5 years, spending her time with her ever-growing family, tending her garden and writing down the full story of her life for future generations. On quiet evenings, she'd sit on the porch and talk to Quinn as if he were still there beside her, telling him about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the changes coming to Nevada and to the world beyond. When her time finally came, surrounded by her children in the house Quinn had built for her so many years ago, Zelda's last thoughts were of that day in the general store, of a moment of desperation that had led to a lifetime of love, of a stranger who'd become her whole world, of gray eyes and a lazy drawl and the words that had changed everything. "I think you'll want to reconsider that." Such a simple phrase, but it had set everything in motion, had given her not just a fair price for those pelts, but a fair chance at the life she'd always wanted. And she'd taken that chance and built something beautiful from it, something that would last long after she was gone. Her final smile was peaceful, content in the knowledge that she'd lived well and loved deeply, that she'd honored her parents' dream while creating her own, that she'd found her purpose and her partner, and had made the most of both. The girl who'd stood alone in that general store with nothing but desperation and determination had become a woman who'd built a legacy, who'd raised a family, who'd loved and been loved in return with a depth that most people only dreamed of experiencing. And it had all started with a cowboy who'd heard a trader refusing her a fair price, who'd had the courage to step in, who'd recognized something worth protecting, and had spent the rest of his life proving it. Their story became part of the family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the most important moments are the ones where we choose to help a stranger, where we choose love over convenience, where we choose to build rather than simply survive. In the end, that was the real magic of their story, not the romance or the adventure or even the happy ending, though those were all part of it. The real magic was in the choosing, the daily decision to show up for each other, to work together, to remain partners through whatever life brought their way. That was the legacy Quinn and Zelda left behind, not just to their children and grandchildren, but to everyone who heard their story. The knowledge that love, real love, is both a gift and a choice, and that choosing it every single day is what transforms a chance encounter into a lifetime of meaning.